Alors c'est marrant, je vais faire un tour en arrière, mais on a des différences culturelles, c'est-à-dire entre les Français, les Anglais, et pourtant j'ai l'impression que la situation est la même. Peut-être que Stan, tu diras qu'en Angleterre c'est un petit peu différent, que ce soit au niveau du comics ou au niveau de la littérature, que ça ne ressemble pas exactement à ça, en tout cas la situation actuelle. Mais si on prend notre système éducatif, si on prend ceux avec quoi on a grandi, nous aujourd'hui les producteurs d'imaginaire ou les créateurs, on n'a pas eu la chance, par exemple, qu'ont eu les Anglais, d'avoir Doctor Who pendant 40 ans à la télévision, d'avoir Star Trek en prime time, d'avoir tout un bagage visuel de science-fiction avec lequel ils ont pu grandir. Et donc c'est ce qui explique aussi le fait qu'ils aient été des gros producteurs à un moment. C'est qu'ils ont roulé avec pendant 10 ans, 20 ans, 30 ans, 40 ans. Pas nous en France. À part cette micro-niche, effectivement, d'aficionados qui lisaient anglais, qui regardaient ou qui avaient la chance d'aller... Les frères Bogdanov, mais c'est vrai, on a eu les frères Bogdanov, mais rappelons-nous des frères Bogdanov quand ils ont écrit l'effet science-fiction, qui était une sorte, je ne sais pas pour ceux qui connaissent l'effet science-fiction des frères Bogdanov, mais c'était, en gros, ils ont posé la question à énormément de personnalités, est-ce que vous aimez la science-fiction? Qu'est-ce que c'est pour vous la science-fiction? Et puis le jour où ils ont fait leur première dédicace, ils se sont aperçus que leurs lecteurs avaient entre 10 et 12 ans et ont quitté la vie de la science-fiction pour toujours parce qu'ils étaient persuadés de s'adresser à l'intelligentsia française, et ça a été pour eux un crash avec le réel absolument terrible. Mais c'était normal, mais j'avais 10 ans et 12 ans quand je regardais effectivement les frères Bogdanov à la télé nous parler de temps X, et avec mon invité surprise, comme toutes les semaines, Gérard Klein. C'était extraordinaire, Gérard Klein qui est, je le dis, un grand directeur de collection de SF en France. Donc Stan, tu as une vision différente de ce qui vient d'être dit sur la situation en Angleterre à l'heure actuelle?
I think, although we have cultural differences, I think we have more in common. I think that we share imagination, we share our emotions, and we share our humanity, and I think that that's something that our species, the human species, has in common. So there may be some small differences. I mean, in a sense, what you've just said, Alain, paints a rosier picture about England than is true. I mean, we look to Europe, and we look to mainland Europe and to France for the fact that you have it seems to us, a very liberal attitude to all the different media. What tends to happen in the UK is that you have people who like books, who are quite separate from people who like films, who are quite separate from people who like comic books, and they all hate each other. One of the things I very much like about here is that people are open-minded enough to say that a graphic novel or a literary novel or a film are all equally valid in their own way. And I think that that is something that we're learning from you. But as far as what was just being said, Robert was just saying that you were implying that there's a limit to imagination. You were saying there can't be 250,000 new ways of doing things. I think there are an infinite number of ways of doing things.
I was not saying that there was a limit of the amount, but of politically and scientifically pertinent. And science fiction, it feeds itself from it.
Well, this is a good point. The Scottish science fiction writer Ian Banks, whose name you'll be familiar with, once famously said that he liked the fact that science fiction was in the gutter. It belonged in the gutter because when you're in the gutter you can get away with more. And this is the way I've always approached what I write. Because the literary establishment in my country is completely disdainful of science fiction and fantasy, I can put things in the books that I probably wouldn't get away with if I were writing so-called mainstream literary fiction. You can get away with an awful lot when you're unregarded and when you're despised. This thing about how we're going to end up being a kind of niche, well, for God's sake, we're all miserable outcasts for liking this stuff anyway. We always have been. So we should at least be proud of the fact, revel in it, and where possible, use the fact that we're in something that's underneath the radar in order to be a bit subversive, to be a bit radical, to try and say a little bit more than spaceships and ray guns. So and also, in terms of, we began speaking about how popular or otherwise the genre is. What do we mean by popularity? Are we talking about sales figures? Are we talking about pure commercial popularity? If we're talking on that level, as far as England is concerned, the sales of science fiction literature are in the toilet. You can't give science fiction away. There are exceptions, but basically it does not sell very well, and it sells to people who turn up with hoods on and overcoats and they take it away in brown paper bags. You are a complete social pariah if you read science fiction in the UK. I'm sure it's the same in other places too. However, its influence beyond the literature is enormous. You will be familiar that Variety magazine, the American film magazine, every year publishes its list of the top 50 all-time high-grossing films of all time. If you look at that list, at least 80% of those films are fantasy or science fiction. I mean, okay, it depends how you define fantasy or science fiction. I would say the James Bond films are science fiction. At least, perhaps the recent ones are a bit more realistic, but certainly up to that point, they're science fiction. Indiana Jones, Star Wars, the new versions of Star Wars, they're all science fiction. So we've got this huge, multi-billion-dollar industry that owes all of it to science fiction literature, and you can't give away science fiction books. I think that's a really interesting paradox. Are we going to watch the literature wither and die and end up being people passing it around in underground car parks in the middle of the night because they're too ashamed to see it, while at your local cinema you have these huge blockbuster movies that are based on that very material that doesn't seem to sell as literature? Maybe the problem isn't so much the genre, maybe the problem is to do with reading. Maybe we are getting into a culture now where everyone wants instant gratification, and reading a book doesn't give you instant gratification. I began my life as a writer writing books for children and young adults in the 80s. And my editors then said, look, you've got to grab a young person's attention in the first couple of pages. A decade later, I was told, you've got to grab the attention in the first line, because that's how long you get. Well, you can argue actually that any book has to grab it. You've got to bite the reader on the nose in the first line and drag them through the book.
That sounds like a science fiction subject.
We are living in a science fiction world. We're living in a science fiction world.
I remember of Robert Siodmak's story about in the Tomorrow, Demain les chiens, I don't know the title, where there's this guy who can't, Clifford Decimac, sorry,
yeah.
who can't get out of his house anymore. And what you tell about writing and reading sounds a bit like that, and it could perfectly be a science fiction book as well.
Well, I think the world generally owes science fiction a lot more than it knows. I mean, science fiction said a long time ago, way back in the 30s, science fiction said, wouldn't it be great if you had this little device that meant you could speak to people? And then industry said, technology said, yeah, now we've all got mobile phones. And now we've all got iPods. And it's getting to be a bit scary. We should be careful what we ask for. You know, the old Chinese curse, be careful what you wish for, because science fiction brings it up, technology gives it to us. So, to return to my original point, I think it's very interesting that we've got to the point where the literature does seem to be dying, but the ideas, the tropes, seem to be everywhere. And I think that's a very, very peculiar situation for us to find ourselves in. It's quite different, I think, with fantasy. I know we're not talking about fantasy here. I think almost the opposite applies.